Today we're going to talk about the Gilded Age and the different religious movements that happened during the post-Civil War and before World War I period. We have a lot of different notions of what is religion at this point that don't line up with the same ideas that happened within the holiness movement or the First or Second Great Awakening. We get a new influx of immigrants, and with that, a new sort of influx of ideas coming into America to try to figure out what does American religious freedom look like and how's that going to be expressed in a way that we haven't really seen before. We're also going to see how the ideals of America in the Golden Age did not really line up with how things were actually practiced. As a result, this lesson is slightly longer than most of the other ones, so hopefully you enjoy. Last time we asked what is good. This time I want to have you discuss what looks good. Specifically, what's the difference between what looks good and what is good? Are they always the same? How much do looks actually matter? Sometimes a lot, sometimes not much. What value do we place on how things look versus how things actually are? If you take something ugly and make it look a little prettier, does it actually change what that thing is? And when we're talking about larger items such as people or societies, how does that weigh in? Put a lipstick on pig, it's still a pig. What looks good and what actually is good underneath its looks is kind of the whole theme of what becomes known as the Gilded Age, a period of American history that's used to describe roughly the conclusion of the Civil War until the end of the 19th century, or stretching until the beginning or outbreak of World War I. Gilded means covered with a thin layer of gold, or a substance that looks like gold, or something that's rich and of higher social class and value. The term was coined to describe this period of time by Mark Twain and his co-author Charles Dudley Warner in their work by that name, The Gilded Age, which was published in 1873. Twain and others used this term Gilded Age to describe the disconnect that existed between the elites and the rest of the people. If we look at America during this period of time, things look nice. We have the explosion of railroads, greater transportation, massive industrialization. We have more wealth and peace and stability during this time period than any other period in American history up until then. Things are secure, things are going well. But underneath it, we see that there's a lot of tension that exists. The explosion of rail tycoons, industrialists, and admittedly corrupt politicians really kind of hide the veneer of the new working poor and the massive alienation that existed within the country by everyone who wasn't on the top. This era has as much wealth as it does exploitation and alienation. An enormous wave of immigrants came in and used to drive down the price of labor in urban centers and also to help settle the lands of the Mississippi. And this had both distinct advantages for everybody and disadvantages for everybody as well. Religion also changed in the Gilded Age, as did the disconnect between what America said it valued and what it demonstrated that it actually was. Abraham Lincoln was the last elected president who did not formally join a church. This, by all measures, was an intentional act and choice by Lincoln. The ambiguity surrounding his ecclesial convictions allowed him a great deal of flexibility navigating the sectarian waters of America. Lincoln muted his own religious views in order to shift the attention onto the moral mission of ending slavery. In many ways, the moralism of the holiness movement superseded any theological position he may have had. At the time, the Republican Party could not expect evangelical voters to arrive in any sort of monolith. The fading power of the Whigs forced those who didn't like slavery and those denominations that were against slavery to join Lincoln's camp. Lincoln and his party utilized the fear of Catholics and Freemasons as co-conspirators against the nation, which sought to fashion its own salvation. Lincoln used the growing moralism to advance his candidacy rather than religious affiliation alone. His unorthodox approach to religion even prompted him to be called Father Abraham, the prophet and the agent of America. Voting for Lincoln for many, including most Northern Methodists, became their Christian duty. For some, like Phoebe Palmer, it was a shame that Lincoln died in a theater. His actions, or just going to the theater itself, was seen as his great sin. After Lincoln, to get elected, every president needed to be a member of a church to demonstrate their religious affinity. Grant and his successor, Rutherford B. Hayes, were both Methodists, as was McKinley. Garfield was a member of the Campbellites, the Churches of Christ. Still other presidents during this period were Presbyterian, namely Harrison and Cleveland, and Arthur was an Anglican. Taft was the only president who didn't have a clear, strong denominational affiliation. He was a Unitarian, which for most of the country caused scandal and was an obstacle towards his election. But his identity as a Unitarian only came out after he was already on the ticket. And famously, he didn't win re-election. The 19th century saw a rise not only in sectarianism and the holiness movement, but a whole host of contradictory movement and ideologies that revealed themselves during the Gilded Age. The zeitgeist of the Gilded Age is manifest most in urban centers and primarily in those that are influential. Boston saw itself as the self-stylized hub of the universe, even referring to it casually as the hub. Still, you have areas around Harvard that call themselves the hub today. During the 1870s, a group of men reinvented America. These four men were Oliver Wendell Holmes, William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, and John Dewey. They called themselves the Metaphysical Club. Peirce tells us that among the elites at this time, agnosticism was riding a high horse. One of the lesser-known men of this group, Chauncey Wright, was actually a pivotal member of this group. He, like the rest of them, was a member of a positivist movement associated with French thinkers Saint-Simon, Auguste Comte, and others. For the Americans, they sided against the French strain and tended more towards the Englishmen of Francis Bacon and John Stuart Mill. Essentially, positivism was understood as an absolute distinction between facts and values. Fact was the province of science, and value was the province of metaphysics. As a metaphysical club, you could tell that they're going to talk about values and the place that values have in shaping and identifying culture. The club was a positivist movement, and the point was to reevaluate the value that we have in what it is to be America and to reinterpret America for the future. This included education reform, legal reform, the development of distinctly American philosophies such as pragmatism, and the social evolutionary theory following Darwin. They viewed culture as a hopeful and social political force. Culture was interpreted as non-utilitarian activities and goods, things such as arts, religion, personal refinement, formal higher education. In other words, culture is what we do when we have leisure. William James argued that for America to achieve genuine social harmony, it must possess sweetness and light, as in physical labor. Both the leisure and sweetness of light and physical labor, the harsh parts of life, need to work together to form who we are. Work needs leisure, just like leisure requires work. Culture and refinement meant a better future and a harmonious body politic under the rule of reason with cheerful emotion. This period saw drinking, smoking, and other amusements become increasingly cheap, while education, art, and music became all the more expensive. Therefore, taste needed to be refined, and these were the men that were going to do it. The sentiment was that the masses should have a multiplication of wants, and they needed to be taught to live more expensive. While both Great Awakenings and the Holiness movement used and reinforced morality with religion and vice versa, the Metaphysical Club rented them asunder. They believed that religion is personal and unconditional. Morality is social and conventional. Morals, therefore, do not require philosophical grounding, but can be imposed onto people. For them, the Civil War taught them that beliefs have consequences. The theory of pragmatism advanced by James, Peirce, and Dewey posited that we have a duty to believe, and in fact, the right to believe, one of James's famous essays, but that the true and what actually is true remains only as a placeholder. It's just true today and can be equally false tomorrow. Unlike our holiness preachers or the preachers of the Great Awakenings, the Metaphysical Club engaged with religion and what it was to be religious as academics. In many ways, those were the consciousnesses that they were trying to shape themselves as architects in a game rather than actual players. They wanted to see and modify what religion was and what religion would be in the public sphere, and not necessarily be particular members of anything or overly convicted by their religious appetites either. Theirs was a certainty in their uncertainty, and they believed that they could navigate the challenges that would result from modernity with their own genius. There is a presumption undergirding America since its very founding. We see this expressed very clearly with the elites and their intellectual ideas, but this is a myth that goes to every level of society. This myth existed from the time of the colonialists as it does today. Often it's called the American dream. While this dream has different iterations, at its core is the presumption about the American experience as one grounded in the idea of progress, with the conviction that there will be a better future than there was a past. The shift that was underway at this point is the idea that the better was an economic one. Faith in the American dream was a new faith in economic production. There was a good reason for this, but we are experiencing this during a period where we have new modes of production and tremendous resources are now made available. Most Protestant churches at this time, and many prominent Catholic thinkers as well, supported and defended the status quo in 1876. The rising tide lifted most ships, and America's future looked great. This led to what was called the belief not only in America, but the gospel of wealth. Outside of the Reconstruction area of the South, the decade after the Civil War was a period of unrivaled prosperity. The population grew and the GDP grew 3 times as fast. The term gospel of wealth came from one of the wealthiest people on the planet, Andrew Carnegie, in his essay written by that name, The Gospel of Wealth, in 1889. The aim was to describe the responsibility of philanthropy by the new upper class of the self-made rich. While people might have moved from poverty to wealth before, none was done as much as during this era in American history. People could show up and strike it rich with just hard work, and therefore, what is it that they need to do? Carnegie argued that they owed something back. This is what philanthropy for him was. It is a giving something back because this isn't your wealth necessarily, even though you did it on your own. It's part of this involves a sort of faith in the American dream and the American system, but that could only be done if all players work to the betterment of the entirety of society. Carnegie argued that given the expansive frontier and the abundance of nearly free good farmland, there was no reason why poverty should strike any man who is blessed with health and the willingness to work. He argued that civilization depends on the triple law of sacredness of private property, free competition, and the free accumulation of wealth. These are sacred principles to Carnegie. This allows free play to economic forces, which for him leads to notions of progress. For those who fall behind, it'll still be, quote, be best for the race because it ensures the survival of the fittest in every department. It also produces wonderful material development that benefits all. He taught that the proper use of wealth was to, quote, gain all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. Additionally, he said, the man who dies rich dies disgraced, which is not the idea of dying with the most toys wins by any stretch of the imagination. Wealth for Carnegie was to be given away to the benefit of the common good. This, by the way, is not almsgiving, for that what he would see as rewarding vice. He argued, quote, those worthy of assistance, except in rare cases, seldom require assistance. Giving was aimed not at people, but at institutions which he thought benefited everyone, such as parks, museums, libraries, and schools. Economic policy was therefore a social gospel, the playing out of God's will. Russell Conwell added to this that it was everyone's duty to get rich. This was echoed by many prominent preachers of the day. At this time, we have an argument as to what the place of modernity is. We have those in the Metaphysical Club and the Gospel of Wealth who believe everything is going to be great and modernity is chugging right along towards perfection. We also get people who are anti-modern. Anti-modernity is the reaction against the unresolved issues advanced by modernity. Most of these reactionary movements in the Gilded Age were not strictly speaking anti-modern. They weren't actually opposed to the idea of modernity. Rather, they were those that were disaffected by modernity, but still believed in the myths of modernity. Religiously, the modern thought includes a sort of disenchantment of the world. The protest religious movements rarely speak about a sacred space or time, or as the sacred, let alone include angels or demons outside of just kind of being a conversation piece or a mystical force that moved them this way. The world is still rational and scientific. Furthermore, salvation is still an individual enterprise, not a collective one. While you might speak of spirits, most of the movements and the thoughts were still very materialistic, and the desire was to address morality rather than a spiritual encounter. In many ways, they are living out the world constructed by Calvin and the modern enterprise, even though they're being disaffected by it. Anti-modernity, where moderns that were disaffected by modernity, specifically who we're talking about, didn't call to a return to an earlier era, but rather they used the tools of modernity to resolve the issues of modernity. They pointed to the fact that while wages rose 31% from 1860 to 1881, prices rose 41%. Workers were often laid off in large numbers and had to endure a number of financial crises, including the crash of 1873, the Panic of 1884, and the Depression of 1893. Strikes were bloody. The first major strike was the 1877 railroad strike. Then we had the 1886 McCormick Harvester strike, which included 3 pickets being killed in a fight with the police and a bomb exploding in Haymarket Square. There was also the Homestead strike of 1892 at Carnegie's steel plant, which witnessed the death of the men and 60 wounded with a battle between the strikers and the Pinkertons. We also had the Pullman strike of 1894, which shut down rail transport in 27 states, resulting in the sending in of federal troops. These strikes also resulted in a growing tension between the new elites and the American working poor, and the gradual development of the American social gospel. While the elites believed they were the masters of their own destiny, many Americans felt left out. Politically, they turned to new movements such as populism to help address their social grievances. Like the elites, the populists believed that they were promised a better tomorrow and that this would be an economic one as well. Populism was arguably an agrarian revolt against the progress advanced by the elites in the urban centers. Their answers took the form of economic policy, such as getting the US off of the gold standard. Arguably, we also have an interesting relationship between the social and economic movement of populism and the holiness movement and notions of the social gospel as well. Many of the tent revivals took place in the same areas as populism, and arguably with large numbers of people who attended both. The denominations and other holiness groups and missionaries grew on the frontier in the same places as the populist movement. Populism also turned into pluralism for many. The question of what is America often surfaced. Was America a nation, a body joined by shared cultural values and experiences? Or was it a political state, an apparatus for governance where laws are made to aid civil interests only? America was not ethnically uniform. America was not religiously uniform. America was not local. And with the vast number of immigrants who arrived in the 19th century, language, religion, and culture were anywhere from uniform. While the South faced Reconstruction and the farmers on the frontier faced their own economic challenges during this era, in the North, the Gilded Age demonstrated economic success, and a new sense of stability marked a triumph of modernity. This led many to a sort of faith in science and science itself. Darwin and theories of evolution were wrestled with, and eventually this led to notions of liberalism and fundamentalism. But early on, the lines were not so strictly drawn. In Brooklyn, a Protestant preacher by the name of Henry Ward Beecher argued that the entire history of Christianity was itself an instance of natural evolution. Evolution was just another example of, quote, the diversified unfolding of God's plans on earth. In the church, he argued that theology was undergoing a process of evolution towards perfection, changing upwards and for the better. Schuyler Matthews, a Baptist professor at the University of Chicago, wrote an influential tract in 1917 titled, Will Christ Come Again? The answer given in this tract was no. Matthews argued that Christ's return was a spiritual one. He criticized the growing notions of premillennialism, saying that it forced the Christian to abandon intelligence and education and to live by faith. Instead, the notion of a spiritual return of Christ would lead men into all truth. Isaac M. Haldeman thought that this was a joke and argued that the world, including morality and fidelity, deteriorates rather than evolves. The Matthews-Haldeman debate was over how to interpret a modern worldview and apply Christianity to it. Essentially, it was a debate on will things get better or will things get worse? Can we accept evolution as a betterment, or is it better to push towards premillennialism, a new emerging idea coming from England, that things will devolve until Christ will be forced to return and finally set things right? An early Gilded Age religion that addresses the tension of faith in science is Christian Science. It's right there in the name. It was founded by Mary Baker Eddy in the 70s. As a young woman, she had a number of health issues, often called hysteria. Her health issues resulted in the dissolution of 3 marriages, and chronic health issues continued to persist throughout most of her early life. She did everything she could to seek for a cure for all of her ailments, and she encountered Phineas P. Quimbley in the 1860s. Quimbley believed in the therapeutic power of mesmerism. Disease, he said, could be eliminated by cultivating healthy attitudes. Sickness was the consequence of wrong beliefs. Replacing bad beliefs and thoughts with good ones results in harmony and health. Following this encounter, Eddy began her own journey of understanding. Her theology resembles a sort of merger of 19th century scientific thought and classic Gnosticism. She taught that the eternal mind, her name for God, is the source of all being. Matter for her is non-existent. And disease is caused by an erroneous thought along with malicious animal magnetism projected on one by their enemies. Disease has no independent reality on its own. It's a mental error, either in yourself or in others projected on you. Controlling the mind will aid in overcoming all illusions, and therefore all disease, sickness, sin, and death will also go away. She taught that Jesus was the first true scientist. Christ knew that only God was real, all else was an illusion or an error. The Bible therefore contains these truths, but must be properly understood. Once done so, it provides, quote, all our recipes for healing. In 1875, she published the first edition of the authoritative textbook of Christian Science doctrine called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She then relocated her meetings from Lynn, Massachusetts, where her group was rather small, to the hub of the universe, Boston, and established the Massachusetts Metaphysical College to train her practitioners. By the time of Mrs. Eddy's death in 1910, the Church of Christ Scientist, with its various local units, had grown to almost 100,000 members and had more than 1,000 churches. Today, they are most recognized by their Christian Science reading rooms. Phineas P. Quimby's mental healing also treated Warren Felt Evans. Evans was a Methodist and later turned Swedenborgian. Evans advanced what he called mental medicine in New Hampshire and published a series of books on the subject, the first being The Mental Cure in 1869. Mental Medicine came out in 1872, Soul and Body 4 years later, and the final work, The Divine Law, came out in 1881. Another patient of Quimby was Julius A. Dresser, who joined the nascent Church of Divine Unity in 1882. Both Dresser and Evans advanced the teaching of New Thought. New Thought grew into the New Thought Alliance, and the idea was the mind cure that Quimby and Mary Baker Eddy taught. Both Evans and Dresser advanced a similar notion, putting forward New Thought in a number of lectures across the country. Charles and Myrtle Fillmore attended some of these New Thought lectures in 1886, when Myrtle Fillmore experienced, quote, truth in Kansas City. Truth was the power of positive thinking, quote, the establishment of a healing consciousness through the constant repetition of an affirmation, I'm a child of God, and therefore I do not inherit sickness. This was the power of Jesus and gave them the power to release through divine affirmations the electronic forces sealed in the nerves. They advertised themselves as healers and teachers. They formed a group called the Society of Silent Help in 1889. Later, they arrived at the name Unity. We end up hearing this encounter preached, Unity, Unity, that is the name for our work, the name I've been looking for. It embodies the central principle of what we believe, unity of the soul with God, unity of all life, unity of all religions, unity of the spirit, soul, and body, unity of all men in the heart of truth. The two of them then founded what became known as Unity Village in Lee Summit, Missouri, which is today a suburb of Kansas City, which serves as the Unity World Headquarters and also today as a retreat center. They taught 5 basic ideas. 1, that God is everywhere and always present in every circumstance. 2, that human beings are innately good because they are connected to God. 3, our thoughts have power to influence events and to determine our experiences. 4, prayer and meditation connect and align us to our own spiritual nature and to God. And finally, that we must apply our learning to all areas of life, thoughts, words, and actions. The Fillmore's teachings included a teaching also that God will pay our debts if you speak it properly. Quote, do not say money is scarce. The very statement will drive money away from you. Do not say that times are hard with you. The very words will tighten your purse strings until omnipotence itself cannot slip a dime into it. Begin now to talk plenty, think plenty, and to give thanks for plenty. It actually works. Every home, they ended up saying, can be prosperous, and there should be no poverty-stricken homes, for that is caused only by inharmony, fear, negative thinking, and speaking these things into existence. The same year that Mary Baker Eddy's Science of Health book was published, another melding of science and religion came about with the Theosophical Society. In 1875, Madame H.P. Blavatsky organized what became known as the Theosophical Society, which was dedicated to the blending of ancient wisdom of India with the occultist traditions of the West, all for the sake of religious reawakening and enlightenment. The society taught that there was a fundamental truth behind all the great religions. Therefore, there is a universal brotherhood of the human race. That this truth was in line also with the discoveries of modern science. Furthermore, by harnessing these truths, we end up having a godlike potential that exists in all men. Blavatsky emigrated from Russia in 1872. She was married to a Russian general who spent time in the Orient, and she, during this time, accumulated different teachings of the occult. She said that she went to Tibet and learned from teachers there, and that they were divine teachers that were in line with Christ and the Buddha and other figures. Her teachings were therefore the sort of mixture of occult practices that she gathered throughout the Orient, Buddhism, which she presumptuously learned in Tibet, and some Christian notions that she grew up with in Russia. She interpreted reincarnation as an extension of the evolutionary process, now adding in new notions of science as well. An author of many books, including Isis Unveiled, a master key to the mysteries of ancient and modern science and theology in 1877, and The Secret Doctrine, the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy in 1893, in the several volumes that comprised that work. She set up a number of metaphysical clubs and mind cure institutes that focused on new thought and mental healing. In the 1880s and 1890s, mind cure institutes, metaphysical clubs, and new thought exponents multiplied the religious options that were available. Getting in tune with the infinite and tapping into a cosmic spirit of plenty became a pressing pursuit for an innumerable number of American seekers. And that in seeking, they found multiplying numbers of guides and gurus, from Blavatsky herself to Waldo Train, 1866 to 1958, and Horatio Dresser, 1866 to 1954. New Thought proponents, Trine and Dresser, provided Americans with an open, optimistic gospel of self-affirmation to guide them in their search for emotional response and religious harmony, while such spiritual quests resonated greatly with the transcendentalist musings. They had far less affinity with their evangelical Protestants and any sort of notion of bringing these ideas within a new sort of Protestant Christian America. And thus, instead of trying to synthesize and bring unity, what a lot of them did was just add another voice to the religious expressions of America of the day. The Gilded Age was a mix of populism, pluralism, metaphysics, modernity, and anti-modernity. In other words, it was very American, and it was also very American. Jingoism is a term that can broadly be understood as an aggressive nationalism. Typically, it refers to foreign policy, but in America, the foreign arrived on its shores. Jingoism, therefore, can be understood as an expression or an expressed bias for one's own country against all others. What this meant for America was the rejection of immigrants that were too foreign. Initially, this included all non-English, but before too long it meant everyone who was not a Protestant. And as a good number of Germans, Scots, Irish, and Scandinavians had already settled in the country, a certain portion of it didn't even include them. Interesting trivia, the term jingo is English, and it originated in pubs during the Crimean War. Some have even argued that jingo is what's known as a minced oath, that is, a deliberate expression to express a taboo word by modifying it. By jingo was used instead of saying by Jesus because that would be profaning Christ's name. The Gilded Age demonstrates the tension not only of the frontier as antebellum America did, but the tension of a settled people and immigration. Every new group that came from Europe brought with them their own tradition. Some of these immigrants were welcomed as potential new members to an already established church, while others were dismissed as outsiders and potential rivals that would change the American religious landscape. The single largest group that immigrated during the time period were the Roman Catholics. They came from all over Europe and faced a large degree of opposition upon arriving to America, despite some Catholics already residing in America. Since Catholics today comprise the single largest religious body in the United States, they will be treated more in a separate lecture. It is during this time period where Jews not only migrated to America, but many Jews moved beyond their early centers of worship along the Atlantic coast. Those Jews who immigrated to America came primarily from Germany and Russia. Like all religious groups, the tension between assimilation and fidelity were played out, along with tensions between German Jews and Russian Jews, and the Jews in between and the Jews from elsewhere. Rabbi Isaac Meyer Weiss, 1819 and 1900, moved inland to Ohio. He urged his fellow Jews to discard the old European ways and to replace them with new American ways. This included reforming Judaism to make it align with the modern way of life. Quote, "The Jew must be Americanized," I said to myself, in order to gain the proud self-consciousness of the freeborn man. He helped found Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in 1875, and he grew it to the vision of Reformed Judaism. On the other hand, we have Rabbi Isaac Leeser, 1806 to 1868. For him, he wanted to preserve Judaism from becoming lost in America where their numbers were so few. He said that the worst places were those places like California where many Jews went not to settle, but to, quote, acquire all the wealth possible in the least imaginable space of time. As such, no one wanted to put down any roots, and here the Jews were reluctant to spend any money on the construction of synagogues or to hire ministers because they weren't planning on staying for very long. On the East Coast, new tensions between the German Jews who were moving more willing to reform Judaism, and the Russian Jews who were coming in and were more resistant to modernization played out. This ends up becoming much more an issue of the 20th century, but early on we see this as an effect within the Gilded Age as well. The Gilded Age saw a rise in Lutheran migration from the Scandinavian countries and from Germany. This resulted in a shift in religious consciousness for them as well. In Sweden and in Norway, the church was sponsored by the state. In fact, part of the tension of the 19th century in these Scandinavian countries was what that interplay between state and church should be. And largely, it's that the church came as an enforced arm of the state. Now that they're in America, they needed to cobble together their own money to create their own ministers. And Lutheranism, especially high church Lutheranism, includes a lot of things that your frontier towns did not afford, the smells and the bells of high church life. Although the Methodists, trying to resonate and to capture this group, conducted several of their services in languages other than English, they created 864 German Methodist congregations, for instance, that didn't really capture that many of the migrating Lutherans. There were still 5,532 German Lutheran congregations in the country in 1906. So try as they might, the Baptists and Methodists weren't quite able to capture the Lutheran experience in America. Most of the Scandinavians, when they settled, came to the upper Midwest. Colder climate being a little more similar, plus it was remote and away from everything else, and they could end up living their life along those ways. For those of you interested in a further sort of discussion about the Lutheran side of things, I'd point you to a simple diary written by one of the immigrants themselves. Linka Prius ended up writing the work that's today you can find called Linka's Diary, a Norwegian immigrant story in words and sketches. It's a diary that she wrote where she explains her own experiences leaving Norway, arriving in 1850 in New York before moving off to Wisconsin, where she'll set up, along with her husband, Herman, a new church. Her husband was called and served as a pastor at that church, and we have the relationship between her and the parish as well. We see that in many ways, while her husband was the one who had the official job, the woman in the congregation had a vital role to play as well. And you could even say that the new home was as much hers as it was his. And in the house is where she would end up serving the other Norwegian immigrants in Wisconsin. The Gilded Age also saw a tension between what America said that it valued, the free expression of religion, and the tension with people that they didn't consider Americans as much as others, the sort of tension that existed within jingoistic American policy. And this was extended to the natives as well. We see this played out rather dramatically in what's known as the ghost dance. The ghost dance was born out of a spiritual and cultural practices of Native American tribes on the Great Plains. The dance represents a melding of indigenous practices and their encounter with various Christian teachings. These produced the Indian Messiah, as he has been called, Wavoka. He's also known by the name of Jack Wilson. He was blamed for riling up the Sioux, which led to the violent altercation at Wounded Knee. Jack had a job as a rancher in Nevada. He was married and yearned to return to the ways of his people. As a teenager, he lived with his employer and engaged in daily prayer and Bible readings with the Wilsons. We have his last name being Wilson, coming from his relation with them. He gained a reputation as a weather doctor, a very similar job that his father had as a young man. In 1889, Jack Wavoka Wilson ended up having a vision of a total eclipse of the sun on January 1st. Jack had this mystical encounter where he stood before God and was given a message to preach a gospel of peace and right living. He taught that the natives and whites needed to live in harmony, and they must all work, not lie or steal. The result was a return to a heavenly state where you would be young and not sick. A new sort of prosperity and heavenly calling awaits everybody if they lived correctly. Indians and some Mormon settlers in Nevada joined to hear him and his message. Some Mormons actually wondered if Jack was the fulfillment of a prophecy by Joseph Smith that said that the Messiah would appear in human form in 1890. That next year, 1 year before, is when Jack had his vision. Jack explained that he was a Messiah like Jesus, but not the Christ of the Christians. He said that God also gave him control over the elements so he could make it rain or snow or be dry. He allowed Governor Harrison, that is the President of the United States, to govern the East, but he and God would look after the world above. The gospel of clean living was then advanced, and a dance took place for 6 weeks, and a washing would follow within this. The simple dance and gospel message was taken up by other native tribes, though it was never an organized church. Ghost dance is the name that's usually given to Jack Wilson's religion because he foresaw the resurrection of the recently dead and promised a hope of renewal of the earth and practiced the faith through the dance in a circle. So we have the ghosts and we have a dance, and therefore people on the outside called it the ghost dance. If enough natives followed him, it would have created a surge of spiritual power that would have renewed the entire earth. But not many did. More than that, his message was for a clean, honest life. He said that this is the only way to have a good life. For him, it wasn't about the restoration of all things, but the restoration of those who were present. His message did spread throughout most of the plains of America, and a good number of people followed him, or at least had some sort of mixing of that. Kicking Bear, a Sioux leader and follower of Jack, added to the ghost dance message of Jack a belief in what were called ghost shirts in 1890. Those shirts were painted and blessed, and with them came the promise that bullets would not go through them, specifically by Kicking Bear. They were made for war, a betrayal of Jack and the beginning of a rebellion of the ghost dance religion. Tensions continued to rise, and the ghost dance was then banned by the U.S. government in 1892, and its suppression had significant consequences for Native American communities. The ban was enforced by the U.S. Army, which saw the ghost dance as a threat to its authority and control over Native American tribes. This directly led to the massacre at Wounded Knee. While outlawed, the dance continued until it just diminished in the 60s and eventually kind of disappeared in the 1970s. Jack Wokova Wilson died in 1932. So, what's religion in the Gilded Age? What we saw during this time period is a mix of all of the trends of opportunity and chaos that existed at the same time. We had both native beliefs and African beliefs and new denominations spreading in and amongst them and their own individual religious trends, but we also had the gospel of wealth and the sort of veneer of opulence. We had massive waves of immigrants, and we also had metaphysical ideas that moved beyond old country ideas and a new scientific thought, including new thought and metaphysical thought and theophilosophical thought and thoughts of healing and unity and yet disparity within all of that as well. What we should be able to notice is that there is no single idea that dominates much of the Gilded Age. It's a belief in progress for some, but opportunities needed for others. We have different strands that we're going to be looking at and approaching all over. In many ways, the arrival of Orthodox Christianity in America shows the different trends that exist within the Gilded Age and America at this point. The history of Orthodox Christianity in America is tied with three distinct moves, each of which we see present in the Gilded Age to at least some extent. The first is Alaska. Alaska is filled with natives who had largely converted, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The second is waves of immigrants who showed up during the Gilded Age and started affecting what American religion looked like in both urban areas on the Atlantic seaboard, but also inland quite a bit. And the third is a nativist notion. At least there's one native that can often be looked at. And this is Colonel Philip Ludwell III. He, by many accounts, was one of the founding fathers, although he died before the Revolution. He was also one of the largest landowners in Virginia and Martha Washington's cousin. Ludwell is America's first Orthodox convert, or at least the first that we have any record of. Most of his family were nominally Anglican. He was born in 1716, and he became Orthodox in 1738 after reading the early church fathers. He then traveled to London, where he knew of a Russian church. Upon converting, he returned to Virginia, where he and his family were Orthodox, but also given a dispensation to remain Orthodox, but also receiving the Eucharist from the Anglicans. The Anglicans were making a big push at this time with the idea that they were a apostolic church and possibly hinting towards union with Orthodoxy over the next century, something that is not coming to fruition, at least not anytime soon, in part because of changes that happened for both sides. For Ludwell, though, this also served to hide his conversion, at least make it not so public, because in 1738 he could have faced actual treason charges for not being Anglican because he was such a public figure. It was Colonel Ludwell who in 1753 commissioned the young George Washington into the colonial militia. Again, the fact that he was Martha Washington's cousin helped to introduce them. Ludwell served in the Williamsburg House of Burgess. He also endowed what would become the University of Pennsylvania and was close friends with Benjamin Franklin. He and Franklin helped to establish a school to educate blacks in Williamsburg. He is also an ancestor of Robert E. Lee, so both the Virginia side as well as the idea of educating slaves instead of getting rid of them. By most accounts, Ludwell was the wealthiest man in Virginia. Additionally, he was the first to, seriously, that we're aware of, translate many Orthodox liturgical texts into English. This also suggested, at least, that there would have been a small community in Virginia, and by looking at the documents he translated, even an Orthodox priest, although that's supposition and we don't know who it is, if indeed there was one. Ludwell passed away in 1767, but his daughters, who all converted as well, married and brought other Orthodox men to America from England, including John Paradise, who was born in Thessalonica, a Greek man, who actually taught Thomas Jefferson to speak Greek, and in 1780, after moving from England to America, was the first naturalized American citizen. With all of that said, the history of the first documented Orthodox communities in America are not following Ludwell, though we do have this nativist strand. But they came from Alaska, Russian California, and later New Orleans with waves of immigrants. In 1741, Vitus Bering led the first successful Russian expedition to Alaska. Between 1741 and 1867, Alaska was to one degree or another identified as a Russian possession. With this said, there was never a serious attempt to colonize Alaska from Russia. The total number of native or ethnic Russians in Alaska probably never exceeded 800. The aim for Russia was not the conquest, but the acquisition of soft gold in the form of furs. The discovery of sea otter pellets outside of Alaska created a craze for nearly a century. It is with the Russian-American Company that we see the abuses that did indeed take place between the Russians and the native populations. Grigory Shikhailov, who first arrived in Alaska from Russia in August of 1783, had a fairly notable conflict with the natives of Koenig, where anywhere between 150 and 500 people died. Shkilov is known for securing the imperial charter from Catherine I and creating the Russian-American Company, and for being the first to bring a cannon to Alaska. Alexander Baranov, the manager of the company, has a far more negative reputation. He is identified as the one who enslaved a number of natives. Baranov also forced Aleuts at gunpoint into company service. Hundreds were resettled throughout the company posts in Alaska. In 1794, in order to gain imperial charter securing a monopoly of Alaskan furs, Grigory Shkilov framed the Alaskan venture not as a purely economic decision, but also as a religious one. A group of monastics from Valam were selected to bring the faith to Alaska. They headed out on a mission, and the head of this mission was Archimandrite Yosef, 1761 to 1799. The Verlan monastics headed out on foot. The only way east to Alaska was from St. Petersburg was overland and across Siberia. The journey of 1,000 miles, or more actually, could take over a year. The famous missionary priest John Benjamin, later known as Bishop Innocent, would arrive later in 1824. Within Orthodox countries, monastics enjoy a legal privilege of criticizing public institutions and officials. It was therefore their duty to point out abuses where they were found. The clergy served as advocates for the natives in a place where many fur trappers exclaimed, "God is high and the Tsar is far away." To be advocates, the Orthodox missionary first studied who the natives were, what they believed, and what their concerns were. They quickly learned the languages and then sat down with the various religious leaders. They learned native culture. Father Jen Benjamin developed an Aleut written language and grammar. Additionally, he worked on developing an alphabet for the Tlingits, who resided outside of Sitka, the capital of the Alaskan venture, and wrote a grammar for the Kodiaks. As Bishop Innocent, Benjamin opened a number of ecclesial schools. Richard Downauer, the director of the Sea Alaska Heritage Foundation, tells us, quote, "The schools were designed to train bilingual native lay readers to help conduct church services, of course, but they were also consciously intended to instill in the people a sense of pride. Rather than attack native culture and substitute their own, the church leaders supported a program which reinforced local customs and increased popular literacy, while simultaneously winning converts and building up a strong native clergy who would continue church vitality." End quote. For the Russians in Alaska, the native population was essential for every aspect of life. But for the empire, Alaska was less crucial. Fur was eventually less profitable, and the fear of American expansionism led Tsar Alexander II to approve Alaska's sale to the United States in 1867 for $7.2 million. The agreement to sell Alaskan territory included a few provisions, though, not only for the economics of both parties, but also for the religious life of those Russians and natives who would become Americans. Articles 2 and 3 spell out these provisions rather explicitly. Importantly, Article 2 states, "It is, however, understood and agreed that the churches which have been built in the ceded territory by the Russian government shall remain the property of such members of the Greek Oriental Church resident in the territory as may choose to worship therein." Having secured the religious protection of the churches, Article 3 provided security for the people who chose to remain. They, quote, "shall be admitted to the enjoyment of all of the rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens of the United States, and shall be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty, property, and religion." According to the 1890 U.S. Census, the first that we have, and after 20 years of discrimination, 13,504 inhabitants of Alaska identified themselves as Orthodox Christians. At the time of sale, the estimated population was about 33,000. Therefore, a minimum of one-third of all of Alaska at the time of sale were Orthodox Christians. When the Americans arrived to take possession of their newly acquired territory, things did not go smoothly. We have an account of an Aleut man who was arrested for refusing to send his son to the new American schools. When a group of rowdy soldiers under General Davis arrived, the first thing they did was to loot Sitka quite heavily, including St. Michael's Orthodox Cathedral itself, something spelled out very specifically in Articles 2 and 3 should not have been allowed, and yet these were the very first actions that America did upon taking possession of Alaska. When some of the Tlingits protested, it was then deemed a riot, resulting in then increased street fighting, random killings, and the bombardment of the city in 1879. For many, this was actually a calm before the storm. The storm came in the persons of Sheldon Jackson and John Brady. Sheldon Jackson was the U.S. agent for education and sought to eradicate orthodoxy in Alaska. While this might seem harsh, this is rather explicitly what he was doing. Sheldon Jackson is a name well known in the history of education in Alaska. A graduate from Union Theological Seminary, having briefly served in the Civil War before becoming a Presbyterian missionary, Jackson went on to become a missionary among the Indians in the West and eventually head of the Rocky Mountain District of the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions, from which post he began missionary work in Alaska in 1877. Unlike Archimandrite Yosef and Bishop Innocent, who lived with the natives, traveled great distances to serve them, and attempted to build upon the culture of the natives in Alaska, Jackson simply sought to supplant it from a distance. He wanted to eliminate Aboriginal culture and to replace it with a new American one. It has been pointed out that Jackson never actually engaged in parish work in Alaska at all. Instead, he was a bureaucrat who organized missionary activity and directed others to eradicate Alaskan culture. Jackson raised funds, including public funds, to transform Alaska. By public, I mean federal taxpayer dollar funds, as it were. Jackson's success came with the passing of the Organic Act of 1884. This act provided for a governor, a federal district judge, and various other court officials, including a general agent of education, each of whom would be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Dr. Sheldon Jackson was appointed the education agent, serving from 1885 until 1906. As a missionary in charge of education in the territory, he quickly tapped into the connections that he had with various Protestant missionaries on the continent and urged them to go north. Jackson used the public schools as a means of converting the children. Each would be run by one of a group of missionaries and funded by the U.S. government. Even at the time, it was understood that this was constitutionally very questionable. But Jackson maintained that the missionary teachers were the only ones available to be able to do this job. Apparently, he did not count the vast number of natives who had already been teaching other natives and were able to read and write in their native language an alphabet that was given to them by Bishop Innocent. Jackson believed that it was crucial to teach only in English, as this would best suppress native cultural development. Quote, "It is the purpose of the government in establishing schools in Alaska to train up English-speaking American citizens." End quote. As missionaries, he added, quote, "Your teaching should be pervaded by the spirit of the Bible." Jackson also ignored the statute in the Organic Act, which stated that the schools were to teach the children without regard to race. The intent was for the schools to be racially integrated, but Jackson decided to segregate the schools. In 1885, Jackson also found the best way of accomplishing his goals was to stay close to the seat of power, which was Washington, D.C., where he maintained a residency until his death, only traveling to Alaska each summer. Jackson spent most of his time traveling not in Alaska, but in the United States and getting more Protestant missionaries to move to Alaska, with the promise of a federally subsidized missionary opportunity. To help facilitate this, Jackson divided Alaska into 7 missionary territories, centers that became known as Protestant forts. Protestant missionaries would not compete with one another, only with the Orthodox Christians. And I say this because these forts were not really set up in areas that Protestant Christianity wasn't already present and didn't already thrive. The first place, of course, went to the Presbyterian mission. Following this, other missionary forts were set up. The second was the Congregational mission, then the Methodist mission, the Baptist mission, the Moravian Brothers mission, the Episcopal Church mission, the Friends mission, and the Swedish Evangelical mission. These new forts would be the basis where they wouldn't have to interact with one another, but would be able to take only from the native population, which at this point was largely Orthodox. Again, the hinterlands, the further areas out that had less converts that we know about from Orthodoxy, were not where these Protestant forts found themselves. The aim was not only eradication of native customs, but also what had become native belief, that is, Orthodox Christianity. In a fit of anger provoked by Orthodox Bishop Nicholas's farewell message to then President William McKinley, Jackson uttered, quote, "The greatest enemies to public schools in Alaska are the priests of the Greek Church. The days of the Orthodox Church in Alaska are numbered," and that 25 years from now, there would not be one Orthodox Christian left there. Orthodox monastic Archimandrite Anatoly, writing about education in 1900, states that, quote, "With every year, the number of American missions increases in Alaska. They spring up not among the savage tribes, not in the remote corners of the country, but in the midst of the Orthodox population so obnoxious to Jackson." He goes on to state, "Any one in the least familiar with the early history of the evangelicalization of the country, and with the location of the Orthodox parishes at the present time, will at once realize the distribution of the non-Orthodox missions is not due to chance, but that public schools are opened not in accordance with the needs of the local population, but solely with the view of the interests of the missions themselves. The substance of the entire education scheme in Alaska may be reduced to a propaganda carried out among the Orthodox natives by the different Protestant denominations, the government schools being used as tools in this campaign work." End of quote. The Protestant forts received support not only in Washington, but by the emerging Presbyterian political class in Alaska. Their party candidate for governor, the Presbyterian minister John Brady, and the new marshal was W.A. Kelly, former superintendent of the Presbyterian mission. Even before the election, the intentions of these men were fairly well known: to advance persecution of Orthodox and Native Alaskans, following the wishes of Sheldon Jackson. With the election of these men in 1897, the lands belonging to the church, as well as the rights and immunities inherent to the now citizens of the United States, were routinely ignored and violated. The monk Anatolius, writing his own petitions, laments, quote, "A certain Mr. Brady takes it upon himself to destroy the Indians' buildings, appropriates lands which had been in their possessions for long periods of time, and serve them as cemeteries. He uses a portion of their ancestors' bones to strengthen the embankment of a road he is constructing, and throws the rest in the water." In a petition presented to the government at Washington in the course of last summer, The Indians beg that this Mr. Brady may be seriously enjoined to leave the natives alone, at least in the future. Anatolius and Ambassador von Kotzebue repeatedly requested that Washington honor its agreements and, quote, keep a watchful eye on the abuses of the Presbyterian mission. The appeal to Washington by these Russians was necessary, as the Tlingit natives around Sitka maintained, we cannot get any satisfaction to our just and lawful demands. We know that the Russian government, at the time of the transfer of Alaska to the U.S., did not sell us as slaves to America, but left us some rights and privileges. From time, the Presbyterian mission with such workers as Mr. J.J. Brady and Company came to Sitka, our condition became unbearable. The overlapping Presbyterian administrations of Sheldon Jackson and John Brady produced a number of abuses that radically affected the Tlingits, Aleuts, Yupik, Alutiiq, and other native tribes. Unlike the Russians, who created a written language for the natives and created schools in their own language, the American system under Jackson forbade any education outside of English. There were no books allowed in the Indian languages to be used in schools. Furthermore, any teaching of the vernacular was deemed, quote, detrimental to their education and civilization. The Indian dialects were prohibited. There were numerous accounts of physical punishment for speaking in the vernacular. Mouths were taped shut, knuckles rapped. One teacher reportedly swabbed students' tongues with stinging solutions. Even adults were verbally reprimanded for speaking Aleut in the presence of whites. The Methodist home in Unalaska had many abuses, including legal kidnapping, removing of children under suspicion of alcohol consumption by their parents or other undesired behavior, and then forcing legal hoops to be jumped through to try to get the children back. Alaska serves as an example of America's treatment of non-Protestants during the Gilded Age. While it may be extreme, what we know is that there were advocates for religious and ethnic minorities among Orthodox clergy, something that most natives did not have, or that we don't have documented in the same way or to the same extent. We also clearly see a different approach on missionizing and caring for other people. What the American system advanced was a forced conversion to Americanism, which was advocated by a lot of different Protestant missionaries amongst the frontier and towards all immigrants who came in from Europe or elsewhere. Unlike the Russian approach, which was not to make a little Russia in Alaska, but to make Alaska Orthodox and to keep and preserve those cultures, which is why people like now canonized Saint Innocent of Alaska, a bishop there, translated sections of the Bible into the language, wrote languages and grammars for these people, where their own language and culture were preserved from a otherwise pre-literate society. Orthodoxy in the lower 48 is the experience of the immigrant. Like we see amongst the Lutherans and a few others from Europe, sometimes your cultural background goes away because your religion is more important. We see this with the first Orthodox church that was built in the lower 48. It was built in New Orleans in 1864. The parish was predominantly Greek, but had a number of Syrians, Serbians, and other Slavic Orthodox Christians from the city who regularly attended. Additionally, we end up getting the Russian embassy and a chapel in New York City established in 1870, though this closed in 1883. With the sale of Alaska, the Russian bishop moved from Sitka to Holy Trinity Cathedral in San Francisco. The first Serbian Christian church was founded in Jackson, California, St. Sebastian, in 1894. This was followed by a host of other Orthodox Christians migrating to the United States following President Benjamin Harrison signing the Immigration Act of 1891. From 1900 to 1917, more than 340,000 Greeks, nearly 19,000 a year, came to America. Greeks, Russians, Serbs, and Arabs came to America, many of which bringing their own priest with them, and they all came to America and set up their own communities. Orthodox Christianity arrived in America as an immigrant community in much of the same way that Catholics did. Orthodox Christianity's conversion of Americans actually came with a Catholic priest, Father Alexander Toth. Toth was a widowed Unite priest who arrived in Minneapolis in 1889 to serve the local Greek Catholic or Unite community. Unites are Catholic whose liturgy and practice are the same as their Eastern Orthodox compatriots. Most joined the Catholic Church with the Union of Brest in 1596 as a part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. When Toth presented himself to the bishop in Minneapolis, the bishop dismissed him, saying, "I do not consider that either you or this bishop of yours are Catholic. Besides, I don't need any Greek Catholic priests here. A Polish priest in Minneapolis is quite sufficient. The Greeks can have him for their priest." Toth replied, "But he belongs to the Latin Rite. Besides, our people don't understand him, and so they'll hardly go to him." That was the reason why they insisted on a church of their own. The bishop's response was, "They have no permission from me, and I shall grant you no jurisdiction to work here." Harsh words followed this from both the Catholic bishop and the priest, Alexis Toth. Toth then decided at that moment to travel to San Francisco and was received into the Orthodox Church along with his entire parish. And over the next several decades, tens of thousands of other Unite churches became Orthodox instead of Roman Catholic. He also became a circuit preacher based in Galveston, Texas. Other circuit preachers include Bishop, now Saint Raphael Halloweeni, and Father Nikolai Yanni. The Gilded Age also saw the formation of missionary associations coming from the holiness and revival preachers. Many of these associations worked within and between denominations, though the Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist all had their various boards of foreign missions. Today, the most notable association is that of the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention emerged in part from different landmarkian thought, and the notion of the church always being local meant that there is no distinct denomination, rather only a voluntary congregational association. Baptists also believe that it is their duty to fulfill the Great Commission, that is, to bring Christianity to everyone. Thus, they would pool their money and resources together and hire missionaries and send them out. With the Gilded Age, the movement from frontier preaching and camp meetings to more established missional associations, we see a mirrored change in the country towards professionalization and corporatization as well. Some final thoughts to consider. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution states, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Yet time after time, the U.S. has passed a series of laws with the express purpose of limiting the free exercise of religion in the United States and its territories. The primary victims of this infringement of religion by the United States are typically those people who have the least recourse, that are primarily immigrants and native populations. Additionally, the notion of Americanization was understood by many of the nativists to be a Protestantization. How is it that we can reconcile that during an era where we have such a push towards uniformity, despite the Constitution and vast religious plurality which existed among the Protestants? The Gilded Age also had an increased tension between the elites and the masses played out. What is the cause of this disconnect in your own thoughts? Is it urban versus rural, eastern seaboard versus the frontier? Is it an ethnic division? Is it science versus religion and the sciencey religion and the religiousy science notions as well? It has also become rather important for our presidents and members of Congress to be members of a religion, even if they personally are not very religious. Is this a symptom of a larger religious gilding? Or does it represent a real change in how we look and approach one another?